Excellent. Okay,
Okay.
so let's start off with your name and your name, age, and what street you grew up on in Hammond.
Okay. Name is Charles Everett Burns Jr. Um, I guess I would say I just kind of split between Eaton Street and Field Street. And I guess up until middle high school years, I grew up on Eaton Street and finished up on Field Street in Hammond.
Okay, excellent, excellent. So tell me, in your household, okay, so wait a minute, you're on Field Street first, right?
I was on Eaton Street first, and I have to add, I didn't put in there, you asked age, 46.
Oh, okay, 46. Okay. So Eaton Street first. So who did you grow up with in your household? So who's in your household?
My mom, Gloria Jones was the maiden name, and my sister, Totney Burns, who's a year younger than me. She's 45, which she probably wouldn't want me to say that, but my brother younger than her, Michael, and my brother younger than him, Jerry Leith, Leith.
Okay. Okay. So so tell me on Eaton Street with your mom and dad. First, tell me what your dad did for a living.
Well, my dad, Charles Everett Burns Sr., first, I guess I have to add that he passed away in 1975. So this was, during that time, I guess I kind of have like a gypsy type of residency, because during that time we were actually living in Gary. We were far west side Hamlin Street in Gary, 2nd and Hamlin. And so before he passed away, he worked at some capacity at Marcus Auto Leasing. Before that, he was a professional. He toured with Curtis Mayfield and the Impressions for the title album, We're a Winner.
Okay. Okay, excellent. So, and what about your mom?
My mom, she worked for a time with, and this was right after high school, I believe, for Jewel Foods. Then she worked with the Hammond Police Department, I think, as a receptionist or something like that. And years after that, then she worked for NIPSCO until she retired from the same place, from NIPSCO.
NIPSCO, okay. Excellent, excellent. So what made you move from Eaton, or from Gary to Eaton to Fields?
Well, after my dad died, we lived still at the same location in Gary for several years, actually, and then just my mom, she sold the house, and we subsequent to that, we actually moved to St. Louis for a year, and then we moved back to Gary for a summer, and then after that we moved to Hammond. I want to say it was probably 77 or 78, and from that point forward, we remained there until I think it was maybe 85, and then we moved to Field Street from there. There was I guess a marital situation for her that we moved from Gary to St. Louis.
Okay.
The funny thing with that, I always, except for St. Louis, I only went to one Gary school, and I think I only went there for maybe a grading period, except for, as I mentioned, we moved to St. Louis. Other than that, I always went to Hammond schools.
Okay. Okay. So you just commuted from Gary to Hammond.
Right, because after my dad died, um, after school, we needed some place to go after school, so it was my mom's house, who lived in Hammond, and so we would get brought to my grandmother's house and leave and go to school from there, and then come back to her house after school while my mother was at work at NIPSCO.
Okay. Okay. So the most time that you spent was actually on Field Street in Hammond.
Well, actually on Eaton Street. Eaton Street, we were there. Yeah, we were there for my years as a minor. We were there longer than on fields.
Oh, okay. Okay. And what year was it that you were on Eaton Street? What years?
Approximately I would say it was from 77 or it was 77 or 78 up until like 85.
About 85. Okay. Okay. And so
Right,
so tell me your time period in Hammond, just around that time, up until from 77 to 85, around that. Tell me how life was in Hammond, and I assume that you went to Hammond High School as opposed to
Yes,
Tech.
I graduated from Hammond High in '87.
In 87. Okay. So
Mm-hmm.
now, how was it there at that time? What was the vibe like in Hammond?
Well, on Eaton Street, incidentally, my neighbor at that time, it was one of the, uh, I guess you would say the way the neighborhood was before there was diversity in the community. My neighbor was an elderly Caucasian lady. The neighbor next to her was an elderly Caucasian lady. And then we may have had a few others on Eaton Street. And then from there, it's just various African-American families up and down the block, most of which who were natives of Hammond.
Okay. So where you lived is really kind of a diversified street in terms of white and black.
Oh yeah, you still had some there who were you could probably guess that maybe their families were in Hammond before them.
Okay. Okay. So now that seemed to be, see, you're on the other side of the park.
Yeah, that was the north side of the park at that time. Yes.
Right, the north side of the park. Okay. So, and at one point that was really all white, as I remember.
Okay.
So tell me some of the situations as far as who else lived. Were you the only black family on that block at the time, or were there other blacks?
No. I had the Graham family next door. James and Kathy Graham were the parents of the household. I had the Smiths across the street, and Paul Smith was a postal carrier. And I had the Cloftons next door to the Smiths. The Mrs. Samuels lived next door to the Smith, and on the other side, and then you have the Galloways next door to Mr. Samuels. It was the diversity was starting to disappear. The pendulum swung to the other side. You still had some Caucasian families on the street, but it was starting to swing the other way. So it was predominantly black by that point.
Okay. Okay. So now, what was the feeling in that area at that time period when you grew up there, was it still like it takes a village to raise a community? I mean, did they give all your neighbors the okay to spank you if you got out of line, or
Well,
I mean, what?
I, I'll say that that was probably, it probably had been narrowed down to more of a individual discretion type of deal. You had some parents who were a little touchy about that, but everybody, at least everybody, could say something to everyone's child. So you still had the okay, the green light to correct the children that were on the block. All the children up on the block had regard, had respect. When they were told something, they got in line. If there was an adult telling them something, they would straighten up. Uh, I think we were kind of at the crossroads at that point where it was starting to kind of diminish a little bit as far as that village feeling, but there was still a residue of that there.
Okay, okay. So what were some of the kinds of things that you personally were involved with at the time that you were growing up? I mean, just stuff on the street, stuff in the schools, and I mean, what were you personally into?
Well, I guess during the most part there, I really loved, as far as bike riding, hanging out with friends. I had a friend, Charles and Teron Nash, that lived down in what would that be? I think that was 1100 block they lived in, and they were
Mm-hmm.
into aquariums, and so from that it got me interested in aquariums. I started collecting tropical fish, and between that and learning tricks on my bike and playing sports outside with friends, and just doing typical kid things, being outdoors, just interacting with people. And for me, of course, because I went to school in Hammond, I had a familiarity with some people, but I wasn't as familiar as people who lived in Hammond all their life, because I went to school there, but I grew up to a point in Gary. So that was a little
Mm-hmm.
interesting for me. But,
Oh,
you know,
were you accepted? I mean, because you didn't grow up there all your life, but your mom had a house there and everything. Were you readily accepted, or did you have to break ground to try to get accepted?
well, my neighbors, me and James Graham Jr. and myself are the same age, and uh, that was my best friend once we moved to Hammond. Now, of course, I had different friends when I lived in Gary, and we went to school in Hammond uh, over the years up to that before that point. But once we moved there on Eaton Street, he was the first of my best friends in the Hammond. Very welcoming, uh, great family. Actually, his dad worked for NIPSCO as well, so that was a nice commonality that he and my mom had. That it there was a feeling of being looked after by Mr. Graham, and then the friendship with his son, and it really was a nice way to be merged into the community.
I get
Yep.
you.
But
Okay.
over time there were other friends, and with those people that I met up and down the block, I never really had a problem with making friends.
Okay. It's so funny too, because Hammond was such a small place until you're mentioning some people who even were my cousins, like James.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
he's my cousin, and his grandmother and my grandmother were sisters. And so,
Well,
you
here's something that I just found out. that's it, when you bring up small place. The Hartwells, I just found out maybe a month ago that from my mother's side, I'm related to the Hartwells. I'm related to the Hildreths family. There's there's another one, Simmons, Ed Simmons. He lives on Cleveland Street. Yeah, he lives on Cleveland Street, 1000 block. He's another cousin, and all those are from my mom's side. But these are people that, especially the Hartwells, Leroy Jr. I grew up with. He was a year younger though, but grew up with them. And all that time, I never knew we were related until just about a month ago.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah, I mean, it's like I said, it's such a small town, and almost everyone that you've mentioned, the Hildreths and David Hildreth and all those guys, it's you know, and I mentioned Leo Harwell a little earlier that I've been trying to call him to get some input from him, but yeah, it's a small world, and some of them all grew up together. I mean, well, I want you to just mention upon. I mean, you come from a I would even call it royalty from Hammond perspective, from Reverend Burns. How was it coming, you know, having, you know, Reverend Burns and Mount Zion and all of that, that history coming from that line of a family, and how was the relation with everybody, with you and Reverend Burns? I mean, did you always have to do the right thing because everybody knew you?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And, you know, it became more apparent to me. It was a gradual coming into the knowledge of it. And, you know, I really didn't know, you know, instinctively you would think that, oh, you should know, but it wasn't instinctive for me to just know, you know, the gravity of who he was in the city. It was something that kind of over time. So I would be playing with certain friends or hanging out with certain people, and it would just be the tone in some other people's voices, some grown-ups, say, well, aren't you Reverend Burns' grandson, though? And from that, you just knew, okay, well, maybe this isn't a crowd I ought to be around. And, you know, as a kid, I didn't understand, you know, what was wrong with certain groups, because the thing that was going on is that certain people would be into things, and for some reason, and maybe it was that, maybe they knew who my grandfather was, and that's why they didn't do those things around me. So I didn't see them as being, you know, rough people. And I won't mention their names, but I didn't, you know, they didn't, you know, smoke weed around me or whatever. And so I never saw anything wrong with it, but you had those people, and they would bring that up. And yes, it definitely would make you stand up a little straighter. And what was interesting, though, and it was when I got to Hammond High, growing up in the community before high school, I would have, of course, most people I ran into, they would mention my grandfather, their connection to him or how they knew him. Some people would even mention my dad. But when I got to Hammond High, what was interesting is that I started running into people who were not from our community and who were not black, who were mentioning how my grandfather had helped them with different things, whether it was in housing or whether it was with city employment. And that was something that really struck a deeper chord with me. And it kind of gave me a different perspective on life, because I started saying that, no, it's not just that you're supposed to serve, you know, people that look like you, but you're supposed to serve humanity in general. And so it really left an indelible mark. The people that would just report to me their knowledge or their familiarity with my grandfather, but definitely it was medicine to sit up straight in my chair when people would bring him up to me, and it was mentioning those experiences that they had mentioned, that they mentioned they had, or those the way that they knew him, or they knew him to be a pastor. And of course, at some ages, I didn't even know what that meant. Well, okay, he's a pastor. What is that? What does that mean? But the more they talked about him, the more it became apparent to me what I came from. And so from that, then my instinct kicked in, and it was like, okay, well, you're not supposed to be this way. You're not supposed to talk like this. Or you're not supposed to act like this. And it definitely had an impact on my behavior, just what other people knew about him.
Okay, okay. And then, I mean, even he expanded his legacy by building structures,
Oh yeah, they first it was named the Mount Zion Pleasant View Plaza. I think that's either 920 or 940 Kenwood Street, which actually used to be the location of Mount Zion Baptist Church. Mount Zion was at that site originally, and it was a church that was, I guess you could say, it was maybe the basement of maybe what Phase 2 was supposed to be, maybe, but what it was a church that was like down in the ground. And so that was where the church was originally, and then after that, my grandfather was the pastor that was in place and instrumental in getting the church built where presently stands. And after years where the church is now, they actually went through a renovation project, and they expanded on that building. But after that, where the Pleasant View Plaza is, which is senior citizens, it's an assisted living facility. So people who are senior citizens, as well as people who may have disabilities, that is a place where they can live, and a very nice facility, clean, organized, safe. And I want to say that it's 4 or 5 stories high. But yeah, my grandfather, he was key and instrumental in getting that building constructed, flying back and forth to Washington, D.C., to get the necessary grants and whatever was needed to help get it built. Also, he had Reverend Parrish as a partner, who maybe a year ago now, I think, passed away. But he was also instrumental, along with my grandfather, as someone who helped him get that. But that building was a major passion that my grandfather had. One of his main visions that he wanted to accomplish before passing, and that happened. It's nice the way that it's set up. I guess nice, for lack of a better word. That when you turn from Calumet or Columbia Avenue going west onto Kenwood Street, the first street that you're going to pass as a cross intersection is Reverend Burns Drive. And then you go down to the next block, the next cross intersection is Howard Avenue. And at Howard Avenue and Kenwood Street, you have Mount Zion Baptist Church, which was the church that my grandfather pastored for 52 years. And then after that, the next intersection down is Tapper Avenue. And at that intersection of Tapper and Kenwood is where you have, which is now called the Mount Zion Pleasant View. I want to say they actually changed it from Mount Zion Pleasant View. I was going to string it all together, but I know that his name was now officially put on the building. So it's Dr. A.R. Burns Mount Zion Pleasant View Plaza, I think is what it's called there. So it's nice testament to him and his legacy of being a champion for housing in the city of Hammond, which for that, I got to follow that legacy as being a participant in Hammond for a moment. I was on the Human Relations Commission for several years, which is a commission for fair housing in Hammond. But that was definitely something that was a passion of his, housing for the elderly, housing for people who maybe otherwise could not have afforded proper and adequate housing.
Okay. And then he also stretched over into the political world because the things that he trumpeted were not just housing and religious things, but more political things too, because people looked to him for that kind of direction as well.
Well, he was a major influence when it was election time, and a lot of people, of course, his constituents, the parishioners at Mount Zion. At one point in time, Mount Zion boasted of 500 families in its membership. And so that was basically the majority of the community in what we call affectionately East Hammond. But whenever it was election time, the mayors, councilmen, they would seek his endorsements, and he had a lot to do with who got elected, because if he wasn't favorable toward the candidate, then his people weren't going to be interested, weren't voting for that candidate, which that was that definitely had a great influence on what the political landscape looked like in the city of Hammond, because it's one thing to be in East Hammond in the community, but when the mayors that are running are seeking your support, and they know if I get your support, then I have a very good chance of capturing the election. That was a huge influence over the city, but also not just in politics, but as it pertains, or I guess maybe this would still be considered somewhat political, but as it pertains to the law in the city of Hammond, there was a certain period of time that all of the teachers in the city of Hammond were non-black. And incidentally, my aunt, my grandfather's oldest child, who everybody knows her as Mrs. Hicks, Annie Hicks, she became the first African-American school teacher in the city of Hammond, because my grandfather sued the city of Hammond for hiring discriminating practices as far as hiring for teachers. And my grandmother actually has a very interesting insight on that, as well as, of course, my aunt Annie Hicks. And they have a lot of details as far as how that played out. One being that the superintendent at the time, he had stated openly that it would be over his dead body that in the city of Hammond they would have a black teacher. And incidentally, when my aunt became the first school teacher in the city of Hammond that was black, well, that gentleman actually ended up dying, unfortunately.
Oh, right.
But
Right.
in any case, he had some footprints in a diversity of areas.
Right. Well, those time periods there were a lot of first. You were mentioning first black teacher, and I know Ronnie Rowe was the first black policeman there, and
Okay.
so it was just like a lot of first, and Reverend Burns actually trumpeted a lot of those different those grounds, breaking new grounds, and as a person who spearheaded a lot of different events that for the social upliftment of of just black people in that area. And it just appeared at that particular time when he was running the streets is that there were only things that we could, that were afforded to us just because we were black, that we can only, we stayed in a certain area, we did a certain thing, we can only do a certain thing. If we went outside of a certain area, then we would be, it's not like we couldn't go outside that area, but there would be certain dissonance that would happen in those areas of, you know, the racial injustices and that whole thing.
Right.
But in your time period, what kinds of racial injustices that did you see, or if any?
You know, it
Or did it open up?
I think, unfortunately, one racial injustice that has been constant and growing, and I think all the ones that I'm going to mention, they have all kind of grown rather than deflate, unfortunately. And one that I don't want to leave out of the scope, because a lot of times when we talk about racial injustice, we talk about what has been done to us by others. And I think one racial injustice that I never understood, and this is something that I know it's part of my DNA more so than it's something that I've been exposed to, that I growing up, I always grieved over the injustice that we did to ourselves, the infighting. And that was something, as much as we can talk about all the good times in East Hammond, as we called it, as much as we can talk about all the families and what we could do, and you mentioned yourself as far as there used to be a time you can walk, you know, from one end of Hammond in the black neighborhood to the other side, and it'd be nighttime and not have a problem. That was something that was popular. We used to all walk. That was, you know, be out walking, hanging out walking at night. But there was also a lot of infighting in communities. You had these factions, these different people that, you know, they had an issue with somebody else. You know, we had, you know, the car thefts, you know, and I won't mention names, but we had certain families that were known for stealing cars, but stealing them from their own people in their own community. Conkey Street, you know, Conkey Street was really bad, you know, where, you know, I heard at one time that Conkey Street was like one of the most dangerous places in America, you know, when you started talking about, you know, the different places where it was not a safe place to walk down the street, and there was that little corner of Tapper and Conkey, you know, and you had people that get shot with shotguns, and, you know, that was something that was, you know, I found unfortunate, and actually there were several times that I found myself playing the moderator between two groups. One time got my mother's, I went to try and, you know, create what I guess I call a peace treaty between, it was two dance crews. And, you know, one dance crew want to fight the other one, and all the arguments, little, you know, silly things. My mother's window got busted out because I sat down between two people and tried to, you know, see, hey, you know, why are we fighting? You know, we're supposed to be together. You know, I talk about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and, you know, at that time, my limited knowledge of exactly the totality of what he represented and what he did. But, you know, I was most grieved by that. And, you know, the all popular Friday after school fights, you know, that, you know, and some other, you know, some other communities, you know, maybe more affluent communities, non-black, you know, that's not the highlight of their life. But unfortunately for us, and I know growing up and during my time, you know, Friday after school, there was, especially when the weather was nice, you could always count on it. We were always, and, you know, for some people, they'll hear me say that, it's like, oh, well, that's life. That's growing up. For me, I always found it as not normal, you know, not acceptable, and something that we should be better than, beyond. But other than that, police was a huge factor. And, you how they dealt with crime in our community as opposed to how they dealt with the same crimes or similar crimes in other communities, how we were dealt with during a traffic stop, or if it was just walking down the street and got stopped, as opposed to in other communities, how they were dealt with. I found, there to be a huge disparity between the two, and I experienced it first, when, not driving, not being old enough to drive, riding the bike or walking down the street, and then once I started driving, and then as far as being in certain communities, you had that thing you mentioned that, we would cross over to other communities and we would end up having, we would be met with a different set of circumstances, different experiences of, tension. Because we were there was, I think from those communities' perspective, there was an expectation of us because we were in their community. And we were kind of dealt with accordingly. And so, that was probably before becoming an adult, that was probably the main experience I had. And then once venturing into adulthood, I found it in first general private sector employment. There was a huge disparity between the white versus black roster of employees. And even once I got hired at a facility or at a business, a company in Hammond, it was much harder to refer someone black to get them hired than it was watching my coworkers get their friends and family hired. And so that was something that was really interesting. But also city employment. There was, and I think actually for the fire department in Hammond, that imbalance still exists a little bit, but not as much. In the police department, it still exists. I know there was a time in other departments in the city, a few of them being the water department and the parks department, you had that problem. Now, when it came to the sanitation department, you had a lot more equality there, and I'll just throw it up in the air, being facetious, saying for whatever reason, which the garbage collection, but you had an issue with equality in employment in the city of Hammond, which was something that my grandfather, he was also someone who pushed in those areas, but I can say he didn't eliminate it. I don't know if anybody could have eliminated it because it still exists today. We're in the 21st century, and it's still a problem in some departments in the city. But I can say I personally experienced the discrimination in both the private sector as well as the municipal employment in the city of Hammond. And I did work in the city of Hammond in the parks department for a time, along with full-time employment at another job. But I would say it was more through administrative entities than the social discrimination wasn't as prevalent as the years went by. So even now in the city of Hammond, socially, I think that things are not as bad as far as racial tension is concerned until you get in the areas of some groups like gangs and things like that. Then you have a section in Hammond that's predominantly Hispanic versus the part of Hammond that's predominantly black. You have definitely some tension there. But as far as just in the general social realm, I think that the climate is pretty much even keel.
Mm, dang. Yeah, and that's a situation where things change and start off because you're saying originally starting off at a company. You didn't mention the name of the company. There may have been some racial tension there in terms of hiring practices
Oh yeah.
and such. And then maybe it relaxed a little bit more with more and more blacks advancing, getting higher degrees, higher education, and just certain things. It relaxed with the time, and certainly all the civil rights issues that were going on in the 60s, 70s, and this, that, and the other with Dr. King, and then with the people who even, Reverend Burns fighting for the people in East Hammond, things, it seemed, tend to kind of, I wouldn't say resolve, but eased up a little. And so now at Hammond High, when you were there, was it predominantly, at one point it was predominantly white a long time ago. Then
Right.
some blacks came, and then it kind of transitioned over to predominantly black. When you were there, was it during the transition? Like, what was the breakdown of black to white there when you were going there?
I want to say that it was getting to the place where it was just about maybe, I would say about at least a third black, and then you had your Hispanics, and then you of course had Caucasian. I would say it was about a third black while I was there. It may be about half and half now. Actually, it's probably more black and Hispanic than it is white. But during the time while I was there, there was still a healthy diversity, and we really, it was the time period while I was at middle school. I went to Eggers for middle school. It was a period of time while I was at middle school when I think there was high racial tension at Hammond High, because it was that one group that was probably the last of that regime that remembered when there was tech in Hammond High. And tech had been going away for a little while, but then, their parents, their cousins, their, people kind of keep the history and the memory alive and say, oh, this is how it used to be. And so they go to school with that expectation. By the time I got there, everyone was pretty much acclimated to the thought and the acceptance that, hey, we have a mixed group. We go to school with them. They went to school with us, in middle school, and those were the same people who transitioned over.
Okay. And at that time, did the racial tension ease up, or did it increase with the mixture that you had? Yes.
When I got there, it had greatly diminished. There were a few isolated cases, but it had greatly diminished. When I was in middle school, I think it was 6th or 7th grade year. It wasn't my 8th grade year, but 6th or 7th grade year, we had heard reports about how they had riots at Hammond High, and it was black and white riot. And, we were all nervous about it in middle school, thinking that, oh, when we get there, this is going to be horrible. What are we going to do? And along with the riots, to add to that, you have what they call initiation. So now you're looking forward to going there and running into possible riots. Plus, you got the initiation that you're going to get beat up because you're underclassmen. So, it was a really it wasn't an inviting expectation. But while we were there were stories about I forget the name of the guy. I used to remember his name, who it was that they told me this particular instance where he was running across a parking lot, and there were a group of white students chasing him, and he was a basketball player for Hammond High. And they were always talking about, oh, this guy can jump so high. And he took a leap and jumped to the top of the fence. And I think the Hammond High fence there, as you come out of that gym door in the back, was like I think it was maybe like 6 foot tall. And they said this guy took a leap from the parking lot pavement, and he stepped to the top of the fence in one leap, and someone grabbed his foot as he was at the top of the fence, and he came down and actually hit his face on the pavement on the other side. But from stories like that, we were all petrified. It's like, oh, what's going to happen? And even when we were walking home from school, we had to walk past Hammond High. So, we got out at different times. They got out, I think, a little bit earlier than we did. So they were all gone by the time we got out of school, most of them. But that's what the climate was like before getting to Hammond High. But by the time we got to Hammond High, it was completely different. There was nothing like that. So I guess the only thing I could guess is those people were juniors and seniors while we were at Eggers. And by the time we got there, the mindset was totally different.
Okay. So also in your time period, who were some of the movers and shakers who came from Hammond, who made life for the blacks in that area better? Who stirred it up, and who were some of the movers and shakers that, if you can remember?
Well, I guess on different fronts, my grandfather actually was still relevant, actually some years beyond my high school years. And, that would be from a faith standpoint, political, social, as it pertained to, I guess, a lot of things. Some people in the community who may have not had an official position as far as involved with something in the city from a municipal administrative standpoint from the city. Pastor Lee Franks was definitely for a moral standard. He was someone in the community that a lot of people and also young people looked up to. And I remember there were some individuals that were hanging out in the park that were known as bad boys. And Pastor Franks, Elder Franks, would walk out there. I think he was actually up to the level of superintendent in his religious circle. And he would just simply come out and walk out in the park, and his presence had influence where it would change the climate, change the temperament of what was going on. So you had people out there fighting, and he just walk out in the park, and it would change a bunch of situations. And I know you remember Maywood Park, the Pavilion, and it was a rough spot, but he had really started to have some influence, and there were some individuals that they might have gone a lot sooner. One of them, he ended up leaving here a little after that, but I think his life would have been cut short a lot sooner if it hadn't been for influences like that. But then there were some other people who they turned and they went in different directions because of that. You have, of course, different people politically. One would be McKinley Nedall. He was a person I think.
Was that McKinley Nedall?
Yes, Nedall.
Nedall.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Nutall. Yeah, he was a councilman, where currently Councilman Anthony Higgs in the third, which is East Hampton.
Uh-huh.
He was councilman for many years, and he he was a person that was influential before him. I think it was Maurice uh, uh, Parrish who was councilman before him, and each one of them, they they really really were positive influences. And I guess I should point to uh, uh, Councilman Parrish. He was definitely one who carried a strong moral presence.
Okay, that's Frank Parrish. Is that
No, I thought there are several parishes. I want to say it was Maurice
Maurice Parrish?
Parrish.
Okay.
I think. Well, the McClendons or anyone else of the people that you mentioned, or even if you speak again with Paul Walker, they'll be able to tell you which parish for sure it was. But he was council person, I believe it was right before Mr. Nuttall. Mr. Nuttall
I get
actually
you.
still goes to Mount Zion, Mr. Nuttall.
I get you. Okay.
But along with that, go ahead.
No, go ahead. If there's some more.
I was,
No.
well, yeah, definitely. During the time that um, Hammond High sports were real big, you had Mr. George Green. He was very influential among a lot of the young people. Very influential. He was both football and track. You also had Mr. Brown, who since after high school, I don't think I have much contact with Mr. Brown, so I don't remember Mr. Brown's first name, but he might have still been in the mix while you were in Hammond for Hammond High football. Though you probably would have been at Gavitt then. From
Actually, I
166.
left Hammond a little earlier to move to California, and
Okay.
so I actually went to high school in California, and then I went to UCLA and then USC, and I stayed in California since then. And so, but I would come back, and you go away, you still come back. My dad still lives in Hammond, so I always come back and visit him. And one time I knew I wasn't going to be there for the school year, but yet I worked out with the Hammond High football team, thinking, but I knew I was going away, but I just want to work out with the team. So, but go ahead.
Yeah, but those coaches that I mentioned, the reason that they were influential is because, and I think a lot of coaches in that time period, and some coaches now, but the generation is a lot rougher around the edges as far as acknowledging, recognizing a hierarchy. But back then, those coaches really took the time to speak into the lives of the youth.
Yes.
It was just something that you were going to experience if you went out for the team. You weren't just going to come and be coached. You're going to come and they're going to talk to you about life lessons, and they'll try and steer you on the right path. And I mean, for that matter, there are a lot of teachers, that I can mention that about. One that was a teacher then, who's now the superintendent of schools in Hammond, Dr. Watkins, who's African American. He's actually the first African American superintendent of the school city of Hammond. But he's one of those people, who took the time to try and mentor his students when he was a teacher. Then he went to a principal. Then he went to a superintendent. them out. But these were teachers who were African American teachers who I think they recognize how and I think maybe this took place in that era and before in most schools in the relationship between African American teachers with African American students. They knew what their students were up against, and they wanted to try and prepare them. And that's the experience. That's the experience that I got, and I know all the people I grew up with that we all had.
Right. Do you think that's the if you compare the early Hammond with say your period Hammond to Hammond now, do you think that that's the difference of the students now? Because right now there's a lot of problems with Hammond, and whether it's the new people who moved into Hammond who didn't have that historical kind of feeling with all of the different families who just didn't have that connection. Do you think it's
dead on.
Okay?
I think the teachers have a major role, but another thing that you just mentioned, that connection with the history. The thing that some other groups of people have, they never forget their history. They never forget the cloth they were cut from. And now we have this hyper individuality type of culture. And I think it's something that we're experiencing nationally in general, but you have pods of people who still maintain a sense of self and where they came from. But I think African Americans are particularly affected in a negative way, that we have a disconnect. And I think definitely the teachers helped to keep that connection, because they were like a reinforcement for whatever was taught at the home, or they were an initial enforcement for maybe some things that, because, you have to face it, that we are a broken people, as it pertains to culturally. We don't really have an identifiable culture, as far as African Americans are concerned. We don't have an active identifiable culture. We're kind of haphazard, if you grow up in a certain area, a certain neighborhood, you might have a culture that you came from in that particular, that little circle. But then you move 500 miles in another area, you have there's no connection with, what you have where you move. But as it pertains to some other groups, they vary from region to region somewhat. They take on a different flavor if it's southern versus northern, but there is a common thread that they have as far as sustaining, as far as economic building, growth, economic wealth building, as far as even their faith culture. They have common threads that they seem to, and that thread may even be, as far as faith, it may be having an absence of faith. They say, well, my grandmother, my grandfather, my great-grandparents, my great-great-grandparents, we never believed. But whatever that thread is, it seems like whichever the group, if it's Greek, if it's Macedonian, if it's Irish, they have something that's identifiable. And if they have a festival, they could bring those things to the festival, and everybody knows that it's Irish. Because when they see it, they know this is what Irish people, if it's Greek, a Greek fest, you go to the Greek fest, you see something, yeah, this is a Greek fest. If it's a Puerto Rican fest, whatever it is, they have something there that's identifiable. But for us, if we had a fest, well, we'll have some things from Africa, but we really don't have an identifiable culture that is ours from the root on through. That this has been us ever since we've been here. We kind of pull from things that come from they come from the smallest speck of our DNA. but there's nothing from a macrocosm that we can draw from and say, yes, this is us and this is always us. And I think that teachers, for us, they have been that missing link, or they have been the reinforcement. And now today, we went through that era, and it still exists now, but there was a time when it just introduced itself when you had the babies having babies. Right. And I think there was Tony Terry, was it, who had the song that was titled that. And that era, it was an epidemic. It was a huge problem that it spanned across the country, and it was at that time that you had the phenomenon come about where the parents were trying to be best friends with their children. There was no concept of hierarchy. There was no concept of elders. There was no concept of having respect. Don't say anything to my child. And so because of that, everyone became isolated. No one was exposed or accountable to the people that they lived around. And so it was like, this is mine, you have yours and I have mine. Don't mess with mine. We don't mix, we don't share. And I think during that era, you then had the children who felt like even teachers couldn't tell them anything any longer, that's where we are now. Where a child can come into the classroom and they can misbehave, and unfortunately, the school doesn't want to lose enrollment money, so they let the student stay in the school, not be suspended, not be expelled, and the teachers are pretty much held hostage in their own classroom, whereas it used to be that they had authority, but through that authority, they were also mentoring. Through that authority, they were nurturing, but now they're merely trying to survive. They're just coming. They're showing up for a paycheck, and some people blame them for that. But they're showing up for a paycheck because of the other side. Because now parents haven't made their children accountable to the school system. They haven't told them they have to submit themselves to authority. And so now teachers aren't able to be that link that they once were. So I think it's pretty much, it's not extinct, but it's on its way to getting there. And I think that was at least one of the catalysts that created that, was that era of babies having babies, which, unfortunately, I ended up contributing to that. My oldest is 28 now, and I'm 46.
So let me ask you this: with I hear at Hammond High, only I think the number was around 38% go to college or move on to go to college, and there's an attrition problem and this, that, and the other. What do you think in this current time period, because that's where we are in 2016, what do you think it'll take to change a mindset that will help the younger black students or generation kind of catapult or maybe adapt from some of the older standards and morals and ethics, so they can catapult themselves to a progressive position in life, as opposed to being someone who's dropped out and it's hard to get back into the system? What do you think it'll take?
I think the key thing that you mentioned is standards. I think this is something that, unfortunately, we as African Americans have been negligible to maintain. We see in many respects as something that is arbitrary, that is subjective. Or what is standards? Who is to define what a standard actually is? Or I think that we have. It's been a huge misfortune, a huge disservice to our community that we we have played rolling the dice on what the definition of a standard is. I think it started with us moving towards self-expression when we were in an era where we were establishing our identity. And so we wanted to step out and step apart from. And I do believe in expressing, having the right to express your identity. But I think we took it to like mega levels, where even in the workplace, we wanted to not have to conform because we wanted to be able to be free to express. So even if a corporation and you're working at an executive level has a certain dress code, we wanted to come in and we wanted to sport our kente cloth, or which, at a company outing, that's fine. But in the workplace, there are some things that, this is what everybody at work wears during work hours. It moved from that to, in schools, we felt like we should have freedom of expression. And now today, what we think is cool is sagging our pants. We've taken freedom of expression to a level where it's deplorable, where there's no respect in it. But we still feel like we have, we got standards, but dude, we don't. We don't have a concept of a standard as it pertains. And I'm talking about on a general scale for the general populace. Of course, we have elites. We have black communities that thrive. There are sections in Atlanta, where you have these, houses that are like castles, and we have affluent communities also. But the general populace of Black America, we think the thing that's stylish, we think those things that are exciting. We're into sensationalism. I think that's a huge problem. One thing that'll fix that first is our faith community, which I think that we've got to get back to standards in our faith community. I think we have bought into an idea of this, what I call a Barabbas syndrome. And the Barabbas syndrome is where you had, in the Bible, you had the Pontius Pilate bringing Jesus out and bringing Barabbas out. You say, okay, for your feast of the Passover, I can release one prisoner to you. You have Barabbas, who instigated an insurrection and killed somebody and started a riot, and then you have Jesus, who's simply being accused of calling himself King of the Jews. And so Barabbas, the person who's guilty as all get out, free Barabbas, free Barabbas, free him. And I think as a community, we've made excuses for things that we ought not make excuses for. We feel sorry for people who we shouldn't feel sorry for. We want to give a pass to people that we shouldn't give a pass for. And we even cheer on. We have heroes that are gangsters. We have heroes that are, and of course, white America, they had heroes. I mean, the visitor center in Northwest Indiana is John Dillinger Museum. That's the craziest thing to me. This man was a bank robber. He was a gangster, a mobster, and you got a museum dedicated to him, but yet you want citizens to be law-abiding, but you're celebrating, a mobster. But in any case, we can't afford that. As a community, as a people trying to come up. I mean, we come from slavery, and nobody gave us mental therapy or any counseling sessions, during the Reconstruction period. We didn't get family therapy. We didn't get individual therapy. We didn't have a psychologist come in and give us couch sessions. We just thrown back into society, and a lot of those ails still exist now because of that. And the faith community, I think, is key in helping that. But first, we have to establish standards in the faith community. It can't just be anything goes because a person can sing well, because a person can preach well, because a person has an electric, a vibrant personality. They're a people person, and we let them get away with anything, and they still represent Jesus Christ. I think that has been a huge thorn in the flesh for our community, because it's given people the wrong idea about what it is to be moral, what it is to actually love your neighbor. And secondly, our politics. I now live in the city of Gary, and the city of Gary is like a test tube of what black people can do when black people are in charge. And it is it's very interesting for me, because at my beginnings, I was born in the Hammond Hospital, but I went home to Gary House. And I lived in Gary, though I only went to one Gary school probably for a grading period, Brunswick Elementary. But I've really only had the recollection as far as the neighborhood interaction, my classmates with people in Hammond. Hammond is a city that I could say was diverse. When I first moved to Hammond, I lived, as I already told you, my next door neighbors were elderly white people. I visit my aunt on Morris Street, and she lived close to the St. Mary's Catholic Church there that was still Catholic. Now it's a Baptist church, but was still a Catholic church that had a predominantly white, or probably all white, congregation. She lived next door.
That's actually where I went to school, at St. Mary's.
Okay,
so.
Okay. And my aunt lived next door to an elderly white lady whom my sister and I, we went to my aunt's house when we weren't at my grandmother's house after school sometimes. And during the summer at my aunt's house, we would go next door to the elderly white lady's house, and we were, I don't know, 8 or 9, and sitting at her kitchen table drinking coffee with her. So that was an interesting experience. That she would sit and just talk to us and tell us about times. With all of that, growing up in Hammond, and then eventually as I got to be in high school, the section that we call East Hammond then was all black. And moving from there, or living in Hammond, and seeing how Hammond was a functioning city, how Hammond had commerce. Now, Hammond was never like Chicago, but Hammond had means. Hammond had productivity. And then now living in Gary, which Hammond did not have a major steel mill. Hammond, Hammond had, Lever Brothers, and a few smaller industries, but, Hammond by any means never had a major world-class steel mill, which Gary has had since it was a city. And the steel mill is still there. You'll have some of the people that sympathize with the way Gary is. They'll tell you, oh, the steel mill left, but it's still right there at the end of Broadway. But it's really interesting to see the politics in the city of Gary, which is the case for that section in Hammond right now. You have some politics that challenges the moral climate in the city, but it's the politics that also I think is key to our progress. When our politics is geared toward exploiting its people, not really offering any services beyond a minimum amount of service, and still raking in the maximum amount of benefit for themselves, that's problematic in our community still. Because when you go into Chicago, they have corruption in their politics, but their politics still make sure that the city works. That's why Chicago is still a tourist. It's still a tourist attraction. But in the section in Hammond where you have you have a black political presence, not for the mayor, but for that district, you have some issues there where things aren't always done in an equitable way.
Right.
And you're talking about favors that are done for some streets that aren't done for other streets because of the people that live on those streets that those politicians have problems with. But this is us doing it to us. So I think that would cause a huge difference. But because you don't have a black mayor and in Hammond, it's not like the city of Gary, where the city of Gary, you have all black council people. You have a black mayor. It's a little bit different than in Hammond. So in Hammond, I do believe that for there, particularly the faith community would have a huge impact because the faith community is talking to parents. And when the faith community influences those parents with proper biblical principles, then those parents, if properly impacted, will then trickle that down into their households, which then produces that same moral conviction, that same ethic in those children who they then carry it out into the community. You know,
so does it appear that the clergy, the teachers, and the parents have got to be the spearheaders of this movement?
There has to be a collaboration. There has to be, they have to come together and have a coalition where it definitely has to be hit on multiple fronts. I mentioned that, you know, the teachers were a powerful influence. I think they still have some influence, but it's waning. As far as, you know, it has to be where the conscience of people is pricked. You can't legislate it. You can't put laws in place and legislate consciousness. It has to be from a grassroots, one-on-one, conversational, daily verbal exchange on, you know, really what is having manners. You know, thank you, pardon me, I'm sorry, you know, I appreciate it. Just being able, and that's what the Bible ultimately is supposed to teach us. That's what the gospel ultimately teaches us, to live at the highest moral standard achievable. And because of that, I think that if you have that partnership between politics, between with the faith community with, yes, education, I think then you can have a positive impact. And I think that's for our people across the country, not just in Hammond, not just in Gary, but across the nation. That kind of coalition, I think, would definitely change a lot of what we see.
Okay. Well, cool. We actually covered a lot of ground here, which is actually great. I mean, they need to hear Hammond, how it fits in globally, or you know, at least a continental footprint in the United States, how we relate to everyone, and how we can be better as a city and as a people. So, and I think some of the ideas that you brought out were, you know, key ideas and key elements that we can strive for. I think we have it, but I just want to open it up for you to, if there's anything else that that makes you prideful from even coming from Hammond. I just want to end with this. Is there anything that you smile and says, I'm glad I am from Hammond because I extracted this from there, and it made me the person I am today. Is there anything that you can think of that has from Hammond that has given you that sense of pride?
Yeah, and just 2 seconds before I move into that, I'll say one big difference also between when I was growing up in Hammond versus now is that then you had a lot of people that were indigenous to Hammond, and now you have a lot of people who have migrated to Hammond, mainly from Chicago, which
Right.
that creates a lot of the disconnect that we see now. But as far as one of the things that I mentioned where I live now versus growing up in Hammond, living in Gary, and seeing I guess there's somewhat of a negative, bless you, a negative and a positive at the same time. Uh,
Uh-huh.
seeing some of the paradigms that I see here, I think that they would have benefited a, a, a great deal more. And I'm saying people of my generation that live in Gary now, because of course some of the older people in Gary, they had the experience of
Right.
living in a city that was diverse. But in Hammond, it's still a diverse city, whereas Gary now is predominantly black. I think that growing up in Hammond and having that diversity, where I wasn't only surrounded by people that look like me, I didn't only go to school with people that look like me, I didn't only work with people that look like me, it suited me better to be able to interact with people that that come from different genres in life, whether they look like me or not, whatever their economic status. I have a I think I've been afforded a knack to
Right.
have something a little bit closer to a worldview because I grew up with that diversity. Um, and it wasn't growing up with that diversity in an oppressive way, whereas those people in Gary that are older that remember when Gary was more diverse, they grew up in a more oppressive setting because after a certain time of day, they weren't allowed to go past a certain spot, a certain avenue
Right.
in Gary, or else, they would have some huge problems. But growing up in that diverse setting without that major oppressive element, I think was something that it gave me a more expanded view on life, as far as problem solving, conflict management. Um, it was really beneficial. Um, Definitely, of course, for me personally, who I am, by relation, to my grandfather, of course, it's something that that within itself stands as a huge beacon of esteem for me, that to come from that legacy, the things that he accomplished, and he accomplished them in Hammond. Um, he he was not only those things that I mentioned, but he also was a champion for civil rights, having marched once with Dr. Martin Luther King, um, and just just really being a person who not only taught and said what he thought, but who also had substance and action to go along with what he said he believed. And he held those standards until his passing. And so for me to say that I grew up in that city and in a city where his legacy was, and for him to have had the impact that he had, and I think he served as a source for a lot of our people that were able to hold their head up and say, yeah, we know him. Yeah, and even the street that's named after him that I mentioned to you, how that's all laid out. I think
Right.
that serves as a, a, a element of pride for a lot of people that are in the community who can still connect to that. Because as I mentioned, there are a lot of people that are moving into the community now who they have a disconnect because they don't remember who he was. They don't remember, what brought that about. But, that definitely serves for me personally as a major item of esteem and something that I can look on and I can remind my children, why they should strive for perfection. They should strive to better themselves and to try and step higher than where they are, wherever they might find themselves, because they don't even have the type of challenges that he had. And
Right.
he accomplished things that I can tell you I haven't accomplished as of yet. But he definitely left a mark and created some footprints, some shoes that I have to really, really push hard to try and
Right.
work on feeling.
Well, you just have an instant mentor. It's just look at him. Even if he didn't say one word to you, you can
Oh yeah.
pattern yourself after, and just see everything that you do is in line with what is right and what is good and what is progressive. So,
Yeah.
and you're a special person in the sense that you have that embedded in your family already, and really those are big shoes to fill. But, what better person than another Burns? So,
Oh,
all good.
yeah. Well,
So,
we hope that we can make him smile.
excellent. Well, I want to thank you for even spending this time with me, talking to me, and there will be a lot of people who will benefit from this conversation, and just to hear from you, not just contemporary times, but 50 years from now, they can hear you speak and how you referred to someone may have been here 100 years ago. I'm talking about Reverend Burns now.
Oh yeah.
So,
Okay.
but
I
thank you
appreciate you
once
reaching out to me. Thank you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Okay, hold on one second. I'm going to...